What's the scariest thing that happened to you on Halloween? I was on my way to meet my boyfriend at a skyscraper rooftop Halloween party when the elevator door opened and I saw an actual monster. My ex, Henry, who once hit me so hard I needed a blood transfusion. My whole body locked up behind my masquerade mask and heavy makeup, the elaborate costume suddenly feeling like both armor and a trap as he stepped into the elevator without even glancing at me. Henry pressed the button for the roof and leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware that the woman in the corner dressed as a plague doctor was me. The mask covered everything but my eyes, and the historical costume included gloves, a full cloak, and boots that changed my height, but my heart was hammering so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. There were 3 other people in the elevator, which made me feel slightly safer as we rose from the parking garage basement toward the lobby. A couple dressed as zombies were making out in the corner, and a guy in a Superman costume was texting, creating a buffer between Henry and me, but I knew that would change as people got off at different floors. The elevator stopped at the lobby and more people got on, pushing me further into the corner, and Henry had to step backward, closer to me. I could smell his cologne, the same one he'd been wearing the night he'd thrown me down the stairs because I'd smiled at a male barista. He was dressed as Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, which was so on the nose it would have been funny if I wasn't trying not to throw up from fear. "Cool costume," he said to me casually as we passed the 3rd floor, and I just nodded, not trusting my voice even with the mask muffling it. The zombies got off at floor 5. The Superman got off at floor 8. By floor 12, it was just me, Henry, and an older woman dressed as a witch. Gray was waiting for me on the roof, probably checking his phone and wondering where I was. We'd planned this for weeks, our first public event together, finally ready to stop hiding our relationship, but all I could think about was what Henry had said the last time I saw him. "If I ever see you with another man, I'll kill him first so you can watch." The witch got off at floor 15, and then it was just Henry and me. 20 more floors. My legs were shaking so badly I had to lock my knees to stay upright. "Great party tonight," Henry said, still scrolling through his phone. "Should be wild." I nodded again, watching the floor numbers climb. 16, 17. My costume was soaked with sweat under all the layers, and I could feel my makeup running beneath the mask. Floor 22, 23, and Henry shifted his weight, moving slightly closer to me without seeming to notice. I pressed myself harder against the wall, remembering how he used to do that, take up space until I had nowhere to go. The elevator felt smaller with each floor we passed. I thought about Gray's face when he'd asked me why I was so secretive about my past, why I didn't have social media, why I always looked over my shoulder when we were out. I told him I'd explain someday, but someday wasn't supposed to be tonight, not like this, not with Henry right there to see us together. Floor 28, and my phone buzzed with a text. I knew it was Gray without looking, probably wondering if I was almost there, if I was okay. Henry glanced over at the sound, but then went back to his phone. I didn't dare reach for mine, didn't dare move at all. "You know, you're really committed to staying in character," Henry said as we passed floor 30. "Haven't said a word this whole ride?" I shrugged, the movement making my costume rustle, and he laughed. That laugh used to make me flinch, usually came right before something bad. Floor 32, 33, and all I could think about was what would happen when those elevator doors opened. Gray would see me and call out, maybe even pull me into a hug, and Henry would see everything. The last time a man had shown interest in me while I was with Henry, it was just a waiter being friendly, bringing me extra bread because I mentioned I loved their focaccia. Henry had waited until we got home, then held my hand over the stove burner until I promised never to flirt again. The waiter had been fired the next week after Henry made some calls. Floor 35, almost there, and my whole body was trembling. Gray had no idea what Henry was capable of. No idea that the charming guy he might meet at this party was the reason I triple-checked every lock and slept with a knife under my pillow. Finally, we got to the roof. I tried to dash out of the elevator and find Gray, but Henry got off before me. He walked off the elevator, waved to someone, and pulled him into a bro hug. I stepped off the elevator and froze when I saw who he was hugging. It was Gray. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I saw Gray point straight at me. Henry turned around, studied me, and then his face spread into a slow smile. "Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments." Gray's face lit up when he saw me, and he started walking toward me with Henry right beside him, one arm already reaching out like he was going to pull me into the group. I watched Gray's mouth open to say something, and my whole body went stiff because in about 2 seconds he was going to introduce me, and Henry was going to hear my name and see Gray's arm around me and know everything. Henry's smile got wider as he looked at my costume, his eyes moving from the mask down to the cloak, and back up again, and I could see him trying to figure something out, that look on his face like when he used to go through my phone trying to find proof I was cheating even though I never was. Gray reached me and grabbed my hand, pulling me forward a step, and I heard him start to say something about the plague doctor he'd been telling everyone about. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move, and I was stuck there watching this nightmare happen in slow motion, while party music played and people laughed around us like everything was normal. Henry took a step closer and I could smell his cologne again, and see the way his jaw was set, That look he got right before he decided someone needed to be taught a lesson. I grabbed Gray's arm so hard my fingers dug in through his shirt, and I pulled him backward with all my strength, nearly making him stumble. My voice came out weird and strained through the mask when I managed to say we needed to talk right now, and Gray looked confused, but I was already dragging him away from Henry and toward the edge of the roof. I could feel Henry watching us, and when I glanced back, his smile had changed into something else. Something that looked like he was solving a puzzle and enjoying it way too much. Gray was asking what was wrong, but I couldn't answer yet. Couldn't speak because my throat felt closed up, and all I could think about was getting away from Henry before he figured it out. We passed a group of people dressed as various horror movie characters, and I kept my head down, pulling Gray faster, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold on to him. I spotted a big heating unit near the side of the building and dragged Gray behind it, putting the metal between us and where Henry was standing. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grab onto Gray's shirt just to keep standing up, and I could feel sweat running down my back under all the layers of the costume. Gray was looking at me with worry all over his face, and he asked again what was wrong, why I was acting like this. I forced myself to let go of his shirt and take a breath, then managed to ask him about that man he'd been hugging, how he knew him, where they met. My voice sounded desperate even to me, and I hated it, but I needed to know how bad this was, how deep Henry had gotten into Gray's life. Gray looked even more confused and said it was just Henry from work, that he was helping Alan with some big client project, and they'd gotten friendly over the past few months. He said they grabbed drinks sometimes after late meetings, and that Henry seemed like a good guy, really driven and successful. Every word hit me like a punch because this wasn't just a random coincidence. Henry wasn't just some guy who happened to show up at the same party. He was woven into Gray's work world, connected to Alan, part of Gray's professional network in ways that meant I couldn't just avoid him or pretend he didn't exist. Gray asked why it mattered so much and why I was shaking like I'd seen a ghost, and I realized I had about 30 seconds to decide whether to tell him everything right now or try to get us both out of here first. I told Gray through the mask that we had to leave right now, that I'd explain everything but we needed to go immediately, and he must have seen something in my eyes because he just nodded and started guiding me toward the main elevator. I grabbed his arm again and stopped him, pulling him back because Henry would see us leave together, would watch Gray put his arm around me and walk me out, would put all the pieces together about who I was. Gray looked at me like I was being paranoid, but I could see he was starting to understand that something was really wrong, that this wasn't just me being dramatic or overreacting to running into someone I used to date. I scanned the rooftop and spotted a fire exit sign near what looked like a service entrance on the far side, away from where Henry was standing. I pulled Gray that direction instead, keeping my head down and moving as fast as I could without actually running. A couple dressed as vampires came around a corner and nearly walked right into us, and I flinched so hard that I actually jumped backward into Gray. He tightened his grip on my hand, and I could feel him finally getting it, finally understanding that something was seriously wrong even if he didn't know what yet. We made it to the service entrance, and I pushed through the heavy door into a concrete stairwell, the door closing behind us with a loud clang that echoed down the empty space. I leaned against the cold concrete wall and tried to catch my breath, my whole body shaking and my heart beating so fast it hurt. Gray stood there waiting, looking worried but patient, not pushing me to explain but clearly wanting to know what was happening. I could hear the party music thumping through the walls and people laughing on the other side of the door, all those normal Halloween sounds that felt completely wrong compared to the terror running through my body. My legs felt weak and I had to lock my knees to stay standing, and I could feel my makeup running under the mask from all the sweat. Gray reached out like he was going to touch my shoulder but stopped, maybe sensing that I needed space, that I was barely holding it together. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths and tried to stop shaking enough to actually talk, to explain why we'd just run away from his work friend like he was dangerous. I asked Gray how well he actually knew Henry, whether they were really friends or just work people who were friendly, and I could hear how desperate I sounded. Gray said they were friendly but not super close, mostly just professional stuff, grabbing drinks to talk about the project or whatever. He asked why it mattered so much, why I was shaking like this over some guy from his office. I could see him trying to figure it out, trying to understand why his girlfriend had just dragged him away from a party and was having what looked like a panic attack in a stairwell. Part of me wanted to lie, to make up some excuse about feeling sick, or having a bad history with someone who looked like Henry. But I knew that wouldn't work anymore, not after the way I'd reacted. Gray reached for my mask gently, and I let him lift it just enough to see my face. My makeup was smeared from sweat and probably running down my cheeks in black streaks, and I knew my eyes looked wild and scared. He studied my face for a second, and I watched him try to figure out what could make me this afraid, what could turn me from excited about our first public event together into this shaking mess hiding in a stairwell. He looked concerned and confused, but he didn't recognize the level of panic yet, didn't understand that this wasn't just anxiety or social awkwardness. I forced myself to say the words I'd never wanted to tell him, the truth I'd been hiding since we started dating. I managed to get out that Henry had hurt me really badly, my voice breaking on the last word. I told Gray that Henry was my ex and that he'd put me in the hospital and that he'd threatened to kill anyone I dated after him, and he couldn't know who I was or that we were together. The words came out in a rush, and I watched Gray's face change as he processed what I was saying, watched him go from confused to shocked, to something that looked like anger mixed with disbelief. I kept talking, telling him about the blood transfusion and the stairs and the stove burner, all the things I'd never wanted to say out loud, especially not to Gray, especially not like this in a concrete stairwell while Henry was somewhere above us, probably trying to figure out where we went. Gray's face changed so fast I could see him trying to process everything at once, going from confused to shocked to something that looked like he wanted to march back upstairs and confront Henry right then. He opened his mouth and I knew what he was about to say, so I grabbed his shirt with both hands and pulled him closer, begging him to listen, to understand that Henry wasn't just some angry ex, but actually dangerous in ways Gray couldn't imagine, that confronting him would only make everything so much worse. Gray's jaw was tight and I could feel how badly he wanted to do something, to fix this somehow. But I kept talking fast and quiet, explaining that Henry had connections and money and a temper that made normal people look calm. We were still standing there with me holding his shirt when I heard footsteps coming down the stairwell from above, heavy boots on concrete that made my whole body go stiff. A man in a security uniform came around the corner and stopped when he saw us, his hand moving toward the radio clipped to his belt like he was getting ready to call for help. He asked if everything was okay, and his eyes went from my face to Gray's to the plague doctor mask I was still holding in one hand, and I knew we looked like something bad had just happened, or was about to happen. Gray jumped in fast and explained that I wasn't feeling well, and we were just leaving, his voice steady and normal, even though I could feel him shaking a little when his arm brushed mine. The security guy studied us for another second, and I tried to look sick instead of terrified, which wasn't hard since I felt like I might throw up anyway. He introduced himself as Ellis, and said he could escort us to the service elevator if we wanted to avoid going back through the main party area. And his voice was kind in a way that made my throat tight, because I was so used to having to handle everything alone. I managed to thank him and he nodded, then started walking and motioned for us to follow. We went through a door I hadn't even noticed before into a back hallway with concrete walls and exposed pipes. Nothing like the fancy lobby areas, just the guts of the building that guests weren't supposed to see. Ellis walked ahead of us and Gray kept his hand on my back. Not pushing, just there. And I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, instead of thinking about Henry somewhere above us. We passed a small window that looked out onto the roof, and I made the mistake of glancing through it, and there was Henry standing near the elevator doors with his phone out, scanning the crowd like he was looking for someone specific. My stomach dropped so hard I had to stop walking for a second, and Gray followed my gaze, saw Henry and his hand pressed harder against my back, like he was trying to shield me even though we were already hidden. I realized Henry was probably texting Alan right now asking about Gray's girlfriend, trying to figure out if the plague doctor who ran away could possibly be me, putting pieces together in that calculating way he had. Ellis noticed we'd stopped and came back, asked if we needed a minute, and I forced myself to keep moving, because standing there staring at Henry through the window wasn't going to help anything. When we got to the service elevator, Ellis pulled out a business card from his pocket and handed it to me, told me to contact building security if I needed anything, and that he'd make a note about tonight in case there were any problems later. I took the card with hands that were shaking so badly the card almost fell, and I thanked him again, filing away in my brain that someone official now knew something had happened, even if he didn't know all the details. The service elevator opened and Gray and I got in, and Ellis held the door for a second and told us to get home safe, then let it close. In the parking garage, I walked to my car on legs that felt like they might give out any second, and Gray asked again if he should follow me home, but I told him I needed space tonight to process everything. I got in my car and tried to put the key in the ignition, but my hands were shaking too much, and I had to stop, close my eyes and do the breathing exercises my old therapist taught me, counting to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale until my hands steadied enough to actually start the car. My phone buzzed with a text from Gray asking if I made it to my car okay, and whether he was sure I didn't want him to follow, and I typed back that I needed to be alone tonight, that I'd be okay, even though I wasn't sure that was true. I pulled out of the parking garage and onto the street, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, convinced that every car behind me might be Henry, even though I knew he was still upstairs at the party. My hands were clenched so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles turned white and my fingers started to ache, and I had to keep reminding myself to breathe every few minutes because my chest kept getting tight like I couldn't get enough air. The drive home took twice as long as normal because I kept taking random turns and doubling back, making sure no one was following me, and by the time I finally pulled into my apartment building's lot, I was exhausted and shaking, and just wanted to be locked inside. I sat in my car for 5 minutes watching the parking lot before I got out, making sure no other cars had followed me in, then practically ran to my building's entrance, and through the lobby to the stairs because I couldn't handle being in an elevator right now. Once I was inside my apartment with every lock turned and the chain on, I went straight to my phone and started checking every app, making sure my location services were turned off and my social media accounts were still deactivated like they had been for the past 2 years. I changed my password on everything, email and banking and streaming services, and the grocery delivery app, then enabled two-factor authentication on anything that didn't already have it, going through the whole security checklist I'd made when I first left Henry. My hands were steadier now that I was doing something concrete, something that felt like I was protecting myself instead of just running and hiding. I pulled up Gray's number and stared at it for a long time, knowing I needed to tell him everything, but not sure I could actually say all of it out loud again. Instead, I opened my voice memo app and hit record, then forced myself to explain the basics while keeping my voice as steady as possible by focusing on facts instead of feelings. I told him about the time Henry hit me, so hard I needed a blood transfusion, about the night he held my hand over the stove burner until I promised never to talk to another man, about when he threw me down the stairs because I smiled at a barista, about his threat that if he ever saw me with someone else, he'd kill them first so I'd have to watch. I explained why I'd been so secretive about my past, why I didn't have social media, why I always checked over my shoulder, why I'd been so careful about keeping our relationship quiet, and then I stopped recording and sent it to Gray before I could second-guess myself, or delete it and try again. My phone rang less than 10 minutes later and I almost dropped it trying to answer because my hands were still shaking from recording everything. Gray's voice came through tight and controlled, but I could hear something underneath that sounded like he was barely holding himself together. He asked if I was okay and whether I was safe right now, and I told him yes. I was locked in my apartment with every security measure I had in place. He was quiet for a few seconds, and then he said he felt sick that he'd introduced me to Henry without knowing, that he'd been friendly with someone who'd hurt me that badly. I explained that he couldn't have known because I'd never told him, and that's exactly why I'd been so careful about keeping my past hidden, and he asked what I needed from him right now. I said I didn't know yet, but that we should probably think about going to the police. And there was another long pause before he pointed out that would mean filing a report and going through everything officially. I had to explain that Henry was never actually charged with anything, because I just ran and disappeared instead of pressing charges, that I'd been too scared to face him in court or deal with lawyers and investigations. Gray asked why I hadn't reported it, and I could hear the confusion in his voice, like he couldn't understand how someone could do those things and just get away with it. I tried to explain that reporting abuse isn't as simple as it sounds, that I'd been isolated and terrified and convinced that going to the police would only make Henry angrier and more dangerous. The conversation shifted when Gray told me that Alan had been pushing him to get more involved in the project with Henry, that there was a big client dinner scheduled for next week that Gray was supposed to attend. My chest got tight and I had to sit down on the floor because I realized this wasn't just about avoiding Henry at random places anymore. He was woven into Gray's professional world in ways that would be almost impossible to navigate. Gray said he could try to get out of the dinner, but it might look strange to Alan, and could affect his standing on the project. And I told him I understood, but that I needed him to be honest with me about every interaction he had with Henry from now on. We talked for another 20 minutes about what this meant for us, and whether we could even keep dating if Henry was going to be a constant presence in Gray's work life. Eventually, we agreed to take it one day at a time and figure out what resources were available before making any big decisions, and Gray promised he wouldn't mention me to anyone at work or give Henry any information about his personal life. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started searching for domestic violence resources in the city, typing keywords into Google and clicking through websites until I found a legal advocacy organization that offered free consultations. I bookmarked their site and wrote down their phone number on a sticky note that I stuck to my refrigerator where I'd see it every day. Just having a plan, even if I was terrified to actually follow through with it, made me feel slightly more in control than I had in the past few hours. I tried to sleep that night, but I kept jolting awake every time I heard any sound in the hallway or a car door closing outside in the parking lot. By morning, I was exhausted and my eyes felt gritty, but I was also determined not to let fear paralyze me. So I made coffee and sat on my couch waiting for 9 o'clock when the advocacy organization opened. When the clock hit 9, I called the number and a woman answered on the second ring, and my voice came out steadier than I expected when I explained that I needed help with a dangerous ex who'd recently reappeared in my life. She asked a few basic questions and scheduled me for a consultation later that week, and I wrote down the appointment time in my phone calendar with 3 reminder alerts. Around mid-morning, I got a text from Gray saying that Henry had asked Alan about the girlfriend in the plague doctor costume at the party. Alan had covered for me by saying it was his cousin visiting from another city, which gave me about 5 seconds of relief before Gray added that Henry seemed really interested and kept asking what the cousin looked like and whether she was single. I read that text 3 times and felt my hands start shaking again because it meant Henry was actively investigating, trying to figure out if the plague doctor could have been me. I spent the next hour going through my apartment and checking every window lock and door chain, testing them twice to make sure they were secure. That's when I realized with growing horror that Henry knew what neighborhood I lived in, because he used to drop me off near here when we were dating, back before I had my own car and depended on him for transportation. I'd never told him my exact building or apartment number, but he knew the general area, probably within a few blocks, and that felt way too close for any kind of comfort or safety. At work, I was completely useless and couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. My coworker Sarah noticed and asked if I was feeling okay because I looked exhausted and kept staring off into space. I made up something about insomnia and drinking too much coffee to compensate, but the truth was I kept watching the door every time someone walked past our office area, half expecting Henry to somehow track me down here too. During my lunch break, I went out to my car to eat and noticed a dark sedan idling across the parking lot with someone sitting in the driver's seat. I watched it for 10 full minutes while I ate my sandwich, and the car didn't move at all, just sat there with the engine running. I pulled out my phone and zoomed in as much as I could to photograph the license plate, my hands shaking so badly that I had to take 4 pictures before I got one that was clear enough to read the numbers. I opened a new document on my phone and titled it Evidence Log, then typed in the date and time and location, along with the plate number and a description of what I could see of the driver through the tinted windows. It felt paranoid and maybe even crazy, but it also felt necessary, like I was building some kind of case even though I didn't know yet what I was building it for or whether anyone would ever take it seriously. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off any lights in my apartment, and I slept with my phone fully charged on the pillow next to me and the knife back under my mattress where it had lived for 2 years before I met Gray. I hated that I was back to this level of fear. That one chance encounter in an elevator had completely destroyed the fragile sense of safety I'd been slowly building over the past few months with Gray. The next morning, I drove to Maeve's office in a building downtown that looked just like any other office building, which somehow made me feel safer than if it had been marked as a place for abuse victims. The waiting room had soft chairs and magazines and a water cooler, and when Maeve came out to get me, she was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the formal business clothes I'd pictured. She led me to a small office with a window and closed the door, then sat across from me with a notepad, and just waited while I tried to figure out where to start. I ended up starting with Halloween night and the elevator, then went backward to explain why seeing Henry was so bad, and Maeve just listened without interrupting even when I had to stop and breathe through the parts about the blood transfusion and the stove burner. When I got to the part about Henry's threat to kill any man I dated, Maeve wrote something down, and underlined it twice, and when I finally finished talking, she looked up and said, what I was describing was a clear pattern of domestic violence, and that courts take threats like Henry's very seriously. Hearing her say it like that, so calm and professional, made it feel more real somehow. Like my fear wasn't just paranoia, but an actual danger that other people could see too. Maeve pulled out a thick folder and started walking me through the process of getting a protection order, explaining that I'd need to document everything, and that even the rooftop encounter counted as contact, even though Henry didn't know it was me at the time. She said I should file a police report about the threat and the suspicious car, that even if nothing came of it right away, it would start an official record that could be important later. She wrote down the address of the police station and the name of an officer she knew who was good with these cases, then started going through a safety plan with me, asking about my daily routines and where I felt most vulnerable. We spent over an hour mapping out emergency contacts and escape routes and strategies for documenting any future incidents. And Maeve gave me a folder stuffed with information sheets and phone numbers and instructions for what to do if Henry showed up at my apartment or workplace. When I left her office, I was holding this folder against my chest like it was some kind of shield. And for the first time since the elevator, I felt like I was doing something active, instead of just hiding and hoping Henry wouldn't find me. I drove straight to the police station from Maeve's office, not letting myself think too much about it because I knew if I went home first, I'd lose my nerve. The station was busy with people filing reports and officers walking around, and I had to wait 20 minutes before someone could see me, sitting in a hard plastic chair and watching the clock and trying not to second-guess myself. Finally, a woman in uniform called my name and introduced herself as Officer Kaylee McLean, and she took me to a small private room with just a table and 2 chairs and a box of tissues on the table. I asked to file a report for stalking and threats from an ex-partner, and Officer Kaylee pulled out a form and started asking questions in this really calm, professional way that made it easier to answer. She wanted specific dates and times and details, asking whether I had any evidence or documentation of the threats, and I showed her my phone with the photo of the license plate from the parking lot and explained about the rooftop encounter on Halloween. Officer Kaylee wrote everything down carefully, her pen moving steadily across the form, and when I mentioned Henry's threat about killing any man I dated, she stopped and looked up at me and asked me to repeat that exact wording. I did, and she wrote it down word for word, then asked if anyone else had heard him make that threat, and I had to admit it was just the 2 of us in his apartment when he said it. She was honest that without proof Henry was actually in that rental car, or that he knew where I lived now, there wasn't much they could do immediately. But she gave me her direct number written on the back of her card and told me to call if anything else happened, anything at all, even if it seemed small. She also said she'd keep the report on file and that if Henry did anything else, having this documentation would make it easier to take action quickly. That evening, Gray called while I was making dinner, or trying to make dinner, but mostly just staring at the pasta water waiting for it to boil. He sounded different, more worried than usual, and he told me that Alan had mentioned Henry was asking around the office about Gray's personal life, specifically whether he was seeing anyone seriously. Alan had apparently shut it down and changed the subject, But Gray said he could tell Henry was really interested, kept trying to bring it back to the topic of Gray's girlfriend. I asked what exactly Henry had said, and Gray told me Henry had asked if Gray was serious about anyone, what she was like, whether Alan had met her, just these casual-sounding questions that felt completely invasive when you knew the context. I could hear in Gray's voice that he was finally understanding this wasn't just about my past trauma, but about current danger, that Henry was actively investigating and trying to figure out who I was. I asked Gray if he was willing to completely avoid Henry at work, to skip the client dinner next week and any other events where they might interact, and there was this long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him thinking through what that would mean for his career, how it would look to Alan, and their boss if he suddenly backed out of a major project. But then he said yes, that my safety was more important than any project or client relationship. The relief I felt hearing him say that was huge, but I also felt guilty because I knew what it might cost him professionally. The next day, I met with my building manager in the security office, a small room filled with monitors showing different angles of the parking garage and lobby. I showed him the photo on my phone of the license plate and asked if we could check the footage from that day. And he pulled it up, and we scrolled through hours of grainy video until we found a partial view of the same car sitting in the corner of the garage for over an hour. The manager made a note of the date and time and said he'd alert the front desk staff to watch for that vehicle and call me immediately if it showed up again. And he also offered to walk me to my car any evening I worked late. Having someone official at my building know about the situation made me feel slightly safer, like I wasn't completely alone in this. Gray forwarded me screenshots later that afternoon, texts from Henry asking these really casual questions about whether Gray was dating anyone, and what she was like, messages that would seem totally normal and friendly if you didn't know Henry was my abusive ex hunting for information. One message asked if Gray's girlfriend liked Halloween parties. Another asked if she lived nearby. All phrased like Henry was just making conversation, but each question felt like he was circling closer. I saved the screenshots to a new folder on my phone labeled Evidence, and added them to the document I'd started. And I felt my hands shaking as I typed in the dates and times because I could see how persistent Henry was being, how determined he was to figure out who I was. I came home from work that evening to find a small bouquet of flowers sitting outside my apartment door. Just cheap grocery store flowers in clear plastic wrap with no card or note attached. My first instinct was to call the police, but instead I pulled out my phone and photographed them from every angle, getting close-ups of the flowers and the wrapping and the spot where they were sitting against my door. Then I went back to my car and got a plastic grocery bag from the trunk, and I used it to pick up the flowers without touching them directly, my hands shaking the whole time as I carried them down to the dumpster behind the building. I threw them away, and then stood there for a minute just breathing, trying to calm down enough to go back upstairs to my apartment. Because even though I had no proof Henry had left those flowers, I couldn't think of anyone else who would leave them with no card, and the thought of him knowing exactly where I lived made my whole body feel cold. I went back upstairs and locked myself inside my apartment, then called Gray because I needed to hear his voice, and also needed to tell him about the flowers before I lost my nerve. He answered on the second ring and immediately asked if I accidentally mentioned my neighborhood to Henry or Alan, and I could hear the guilt already creeping into his voice before I even explained what happened. I told him about finding the flowers with no card and throwing them away, and there was this long silence on the other end before he asked me to walk him through every single conversation he'd had with Henry or Alan where my name or location might have come up. We spent 20 minutes going back and forth, me asking specific questions about what he'd said and when, and Gray getting defensive at first before catching himself and apologizing. He finally admitted that once, maybe 3 weeks ago, he'd mentioned to Alan that his girlfriend lived near the Arts District because Alan had asked if Gray wanted to check out a new restaurant in that area. The words felt like a punch because the Arts District is only 4 blocks wide, and Henry could easily narrow down my building with that information, plus some basic searching. I asked Gray to think harder about whether he'd mentioned anything else, any other details that could help Henry find me, and Gray kept apologizing and saying he didn't think it mattered at the time because he didn't know Henry was dangerous. I told Gray I needed to pack a bag and stay somewhere else for a few days, that I didn't feel safe in my apartment anymore, knowing Henry might know the general area. Gray offered to let me stay with him, but I explained that was too obvious, that if Henry was tracking me, he'd definitely look there, so I needed to go somewhere Henry wouldn't think to check. I called my friend Reese while I was throwing clothes and toiletries into my gym bag, and she answered with loud music in the background before stepping outside to hear me better. When I asked if I could crash on her couch for a few nights, she didn't even ask why, just told me to come over whenever, and that she'd make up the couch with clean sheets. Reese lives across town in a building that has actual security with cameras and a front desk person at night, and the distance from my neighborhood felt safer, even though I knew Henry could find me anywhere if he really wanted to. I grabbed my laptop and phone charger and the folder with all my documentation about Henry, then checked every window lock one more time before leaving. The drive to Reese's took 30 minutes, and I checked my mirrors the whole way, convinced every pair of headlights behind me belonged to Henry following me to my new hiding spot. Reese buzzed me up at 9 p.m. and pulled me inside her apartment without asking questions, just pointed to the couch already made up with blankets and pillows, and told me to get comfortable. Once I'd put my bag down and caught my breath, I told Reese I needed to practice what I'd say in court if I filed for a protection order, and she grabbed a notebook and pen and sat down across from me ready to listen. I started talking through the history with Henry out loud, trying to keep my voice steady and stick to just the facts like Maeve had told me, but I kept getting overwhelmed and rushing through the scary parts. Reese stopped me twice to remind me to breathe and to slow down, writing notes about dates and specific incidents that I should make sure to include in my statement. We spent over an hour going through everything while Reese organized my thoughts on paper, creating an outline that started with the abuse history and ended with the flowers showing up at my door. She asked good questions about timelines and evidence, helping me see which parts were strongest for a legal case versus which parts were just emotional trauma that wouldn't convince a judge. By the time we finished, I had 3 pages of notes in Reese's handwriting, a clear structure for my statement, and felt slightly more prepared for what came next, even though I was still scared. The next morning, Officer Kaylee called while I was drinking coffee at Reese's kitchen table, and she told me the license plate I'd photographed belonged to a rental car company, which meant whoever was in that car had specifically chosen an untraceable vehicle. She added this information to my police report and said the pattern of behavior was clearly getting worse, that she strongly recommended I move forward with filing for a temporary protection order since waiting could be dangerous. I thanked her and promised I'd go to the courthouse soon, then sat there staring at my phone after we hung up because the rental car detail made everything feel more real and more planned. An hour later, Gray texted that Alan had mentioned Henry was considered for a promotion that would give him more client-facing responsibility and better pay. And I felt sick reading those words while sitting on a borrowed couch hiding from him. The unfairness of it hit me hard, that Henry's professional life was getting better while I was displaced from my own apartment, and scared to go anywhere alone, and the anger that came up was strong enough that I decided right then to move forward with the protection order no matter what it might do to Gray's work situation. I pulled out my phone and drafted an email to Ellis from building security, asking if he'd be willing to write a brief statement about finding me upset in the stairwell on Halloween night. Ellis responded within 2 hours with a professionally written incident report attached, describing the date and time and my visible state of fear when he found me, and I saved it immediately to my evidence folder feeling grateful that someone official had documented that moment. I forwarded the incident report to Maeve and asked if we could meet soon to put together my court packet, and she replied that she had time that afternoon if I could come to her office. At 3 p.m., I met Maeve at the Advocacy Center, and we spread everything out on her conference table, organizing it into a clear sequence that told the story of escalating danger. My written statement about the abuse history went first, then the threat Henry made about killing any man I dated, then Ellis's incident report from the rooftop encounter, then Officer Kaylee's police report with the rental car information, then the photo of the flowers, then Gray's screenshots of Henry's invasive questions, and finally Ellis's security incident report. Looking at it all together in one packet made the danger feel both more real and more documented, like I was building an actual case instead of just being scared and paranoid. Maeve helped me write a cover letter explaining why I needed the protection order and what specific restrictions I was requesting, and she reminded me that judges took threats of violence very seriously, especially when there was a documented history of abuse. That night, Gray called around 11 p.m. sounding shaken, and he told me he'd been at a bar where some work people were hanging out when Henry showed up, and completely lost his temper at the bartender over getting the wrong drink. Gray described how Henry had screamed at this young bartender loud enough that the whole bar went quiet, calling him stupid and incompetent over what was basically just a miscommunication about whether the drink should have ice. Everyone at the work table had looked uncomfortable, and Alan had tried to calm Henry down, but Henry just threw money on the bar and stormed out still yelling. Gray's voice was different when he told me this story, like he finally understood what I'd been trying to explain about Henry being dangerous, that seeing that rage in person was completely different from just hearing about it secondhand. The next day, Gray called again and told me he was done trying to handle the work situation carefully, that he'd decided to talk to his boss about the conflict of interest and request to be removed from any projects involving Henry. I felt relieved hearing him say that, but also scared about what it might cost him professionally. So I made him promise that if it came down to choosing between his career and my safety, he had to choose his career because I couldn't carry the guilt of ruining his job. Gray got quiet for a minute before saying my safety was more important than any project or promotion, and that he'd already made up his mind. 2 days later, Gray went to Officer Kaylee's station and submitted a formal written statement describing Henry's threatening behavior at the bar, and all the persistent questions Henry had been asking about Gray's girlfriend, connecting the dots between Henry's violent temper and his focused interest in Gray's personal life. Officer Kaylee called me that afternoon to tell me she'd added Gray's statement to my case file, and that it strengthened my petition a lot, having a third-party witness describe Henry's rage and his pattern of trying to get information about me. The next morning, I opened my work email and my stomach dropped when I saw a message from an address I didn't recognize, just a random string of numbers and letters. The subject line was blank, and when I clicked it open, there were only 4 words in the body of the email. I miss you. Below that was an attached photo, and I knew I shouldn't open it, but my hands were already clicking before my brain could stop them. The image loaded, and it showed my office building taken from the parking lot, the angle suggesting whoever took it was sitting in a car near the entrance where I parked every day. I forwarded the email to Officer Kaylee immediately without responding, my hands shaking so badly I had to steady my phone against the desk to keep from dropping it. She called me back within 20 minutes and told me to save the original email with all the header information intact, because that could help trace where it came from. Her voice was calm and professional, but I could hear the concern underneath when she asked if I felt safe going to work that day. I told her I'd already called in sick and was staying at Reese's apartment, that I couldn't focus on anything knowing Henry had been watching my workplace closely enough to photograph it. Officer Kaylee added the email to my case file and said this kind of contact showed a clear pattern of surveillance and intimidation that would strengthen my petition for a protection order. That afternoon, I drove to the courthouse with my evidence packet, the folder so thick now it barely closed with all the documents and photos and statements I'd collected. The clerk at the filing window reviewed my petition and scheduled a hearing for 10 days out, marking the date on a form and handing me a copy with instructions about what to bring. I asked if there was any way to get protection sooner than 10 days, and she said I could request an emergency temporary order if the judge agreed there was immediate danger. She directed me to a different waiting area where I sat for almost 2 hours watching other people come and go with their own legal problems. When my name was finally called, I followed a court officer into a small room where a judge sat behind a desk reviewing paperwork. She looked up at me and asked me to explain why I needed emergency protection. So I went through the basics while trying to keep my voice steady. The blood transfusion, the stove burner, the death threat, the rooftop encounter, the flowers, the rental car surveillance, Gray's statement about Henry's rage, and now the email with the photo of my workplace. The judge read through my evidence packet carefully, flipping through each tab and studying the photos and statements. And when she finished, she looked at me and said she was granting the emergency temporary order effective immediately. She explained that Henry would be served with papers telling him to stay away from me, and that any contact or approach would be a violation that could result in his arrest. I felt relief wash over me so strong it was almost physical. But right behind it came terror about how Henry would react when he got those papers. Officer Kaylee coordinated with the sheriff's office to serve Henry at his gym, using information Alan had provided about Henry's consistent workout schedule. The service happened 2 days later during his regular morning session, and I spent that entire day at Reese's apartment barely able to function. I kept checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for some kind of notification that it had gone smoothly or that Henry had exploded and done something violent. Officer Kaylee texted me around noon to say the service was complete and that Henry had accepted the papers without incident, though the deputy said he'd gone very quiet and still when he read them. That evening, I was lying on Reese's couch trying to watch a movie when my phone buzzed with a notification from an old social media account I'd forgotten I even had. The message was from a profile with no photo and a generic name, just 2 sentences that made my blood run cold. This is a mistake and you know it. I screenshot the message immediately and reported both the message and the account to the platform, then sent everything to Officer Kaylee, who called me right away. She confirmed that this counted as a violation of the temporary order since Henry had been explicitly told not to contact me directly or indirectly through any means. She said she'd document the violation, and that it would be added to the evidence for the full hearing, and that if Henry contacted me again, he could be arrested. The next afternoon, Reese came home from running errands looking shaken, and she told me she'd seen someone matching Henry's description standing across the street from her building. She'd called the police immediately and stayed in her car until they arrived, but by the time officers got there, the person was gone. They took her statement anyway and added it to my case file, documenting that Henry appeared to have located where I was staying even though I'd been so careful not to leave any trail. 2 police officers responded to Reese's call and patrolled the area for over an hour, driving past her building multiple times and checking the surrounding streets. One of them called Henry directly to warn him that they were aware of his presence near my location, and that any further contact would result in immediate arrest. I listened to Officer Kaylee relay this information over the phone and felt a weird mix of relief that he was warned and pure terror that the warnings might not be enough to stop him. Gray called that evening and told me that Alan had contacted him with news that HR had opened an inquiry into Henry after receiving an anonymous complaint about his aggressive behavior with colleagues. Gray suspected the bartender from the incident had filed the complaint after witnessing Henry's explosion over the wrong drink. Alan mentioned that Henry had been pulled from all client-facing meetings while the investigation was pending, which meant the professional consequences were finally starting to catch up with him in ways that might actually matter. The next day, Gray posted something on Instagram about domestic violence awareness that didn't mention any names, but made his stance completely clear. He blocked Henry on every platform and told Alan he was no longer willing to work on any projects that involved Henry in any capacity. I felt moved by this visible show of support, even though I knew it might cost him professionally, that taking such a public position could create problems with colleagues who worked with Henry. 3 days before the hearing, Maeve and I met at a coffee shop to prepare my testimony, sitting in a back corner where we could talk privately. She coached me on staying calm and factual when describing the abuse, reminding me that the judge needed to hear specific incidents with dates and details rather than general statements about being scared. We practiced answering questions the judge might ask, and she walked me through what the hearing would look like, who would be in the room, what order things would happen. She reminded me to bring tissues because it was okay to cry, that showing emotion didn't make my case weaker, but actually made it more honest and real. The day of the hearing arrived, and I put on professional clothes, a simple black dress and cardigan that made me look serious and put together. I brought my entire evidence folder organized with color-coded tabs and highlighters, every document in chronological order with notes about what each piece showed. Maeve met me in the courthouse hallway, and we sat on a bench reviewing my statement one more time, going over the key points I needed to make sure to mention. She held my hand when I started shaking as we waited for my case to be called, her grip steady and warm while my whole body trembled with nerves and fear about seeing Henry again in that courtroom. My case gets called, and Maeve walks with me into the courtroom where Henry sits at a table with his lawyer, and I force my eyes to stay on the judge's face instead of looking at him, even though I can feel him staring at me. The judge asks me to describe the history of abuse, and I start with the blood transfusion, explaining how Henry hit me so hard 2 years ago that I needed emergency surgery, and my voice comes out stronger than I expected, even though my hands are clenched so tight under the table that my nails dig into my palms. I describe the stove burner incident where he held my hand over the flame until I promised never to talk to other men, and I described the death threat he made the last time I saw him about killing anyone I dated. I tell the judge about the rooftop encounter on Halloween where he discovered me with Gray, and about the flowers that appeared at my apartment door with no card, and about the emails from unknown addresses saying he missed me. I mention Reese seeing someone matching Henry's description outside her building where I was staying, and the judge writes notes the entire time I'm talking, her expression serious and focused. My voice stays mostly steady through all of it, even though my whole body is shaking, and when I finish, the judge asks Henry if he wants to respond. His lawyer stands up and starts talking about misunderstandings and coincidences, suggesting that the rooftop encounter was just an awkward social situation, and that the flowers could have been from anyone. But the judge cuts him off mid-sentence and says the pattern of behavior is clear and concerning. She extends the protection order for 1 full year, and adds specific provisions that Henry cannot contact me directly or indirectly, cannot come within 500 feet of my home or workplace, and cannot contact anyone I know to ask about me. The relief that hits me is so strong I feel dizzy, but I keep my face neutral because Henry is still in the room, and I don't want him to see how scared I've been. Court security approaches Henry and his lawyer and explains they need to exit through a different door to ensure we don't cross paths in the hallway, and I watch Henry stand up and walk toward a side exit with his lawyer following behind. The door closes behind them, and my legs suddenly won't hold me up anymore, so I sit down hard on the nearest bench while Maeve puts her hand on my shoulder and tells me I did really well in there. Over the next week, I start making major changes to my routine, switching my work schedule to different hours so I arrive and leave at unpredictable times, instead of the same schedule Henry might remember. I enroll in different gym classes at a new location across town, and I change my regular coffee shop from the place near my apartment to one near my office. I start shopping at a different grocery store in a different neighborhood, and I vary which days I go so there's no pattern anyone could track. Maeve helped me create this plan to make my movements less predictable, and following through with each change makes me feel like I'm taking control instead of just reacting to fear. Gray and I sit down for a long conversation about what our relationship looks like now that everything is out in the open, and we agree to take things slow with complete honesty about any shared contacts or potential overlaps with Henry. We draft a simple agreement on paper that neither of us will keep secrets about Henry-related information, even if it seems small or unimportant, because those small details are what kept me safe when I needed them most. Gray promises to tell me immediately if Henry tries to contact him, or if Alan mentions anything about Henry's situation at work, and I promise to tell Gray about any suspicious incidents or changes to my safety plan. That night, I sleep for 8 straight hours at Reese's apartment, the first full night of uninterrupted rest I've had since Halloween, and when I wake up, I feel almost normal for the first time in weeks. Reese makes pancakes in her tiny kitchen, and I tell her this is the first morning where I haven't woken up with my heart already racing, where my first thought wasn't about checking locks or looking out windows. The next day, Reese comes with me back to my own apartment, and we do a full safety check together, examining the new locks that were installed while I was staying with her. We test the security camera in the hallway to make sure it's recording properly, and we place pepper spray by the front door and another canister by my bedside table. Walking back into my own space feels like reclaiming something Henry tried to take from me, and I'm proud of myself for not letting fear keep me away forever. Gray texts me that afternoon with news from Alan that Henry's suspension from work has been extended, while HR completes their full review of the complaints against him, and that the big project Henry was leading has been completely reassigned to a different team. Officer Kaylee calls me the same day to confirm that Henry hasn't violated the protection order since the hearing, and she gives me her direct phone number to call anytime if that changes. She tells me the initial report phase is officially closed now that the order is in place, but she'll keep the case file active in case I need to add anything later. Maeve connects me with a trauma counselor who works specifically with domestic violence survivors, and I schedule my intake appointment for the following week. Knowing I'll have professional support for the longer process of healing makes the future feel less scary, like I'm building a real foundation for recovery instead of just surviving one day at a time. I start a new evening routine in my apartment that helps me feel safe and grounded, making tea in my favorite mug and reading for an hour before bed. I check that all my safety measures are in place, but I do it calmly now instead of frantically, testing the door lock and glancing at the security camera feed on my phone. The knife goes back in the kitchen drawer where it belongs instead of under my mattress, and while I'm still aware of every sound in the hallway, I'm not jumping at every single one anymore. I can hear my neighbors coming home from work and kids running in the apartment above me, and these normal sounds don't send me into panic mode like they did before. I look at the evidence folder sitting on my desk with all the documentation I gathered, and I realize I don't need to keep adding to it every day because the protection order is doing its job. My phone buzzes with a text from Gray asking how I'm doing, and I respond that I'm okay, that I'm actually starting to feel safe again for the first time in years. I open the evidence log on my laptop one more time and start typing the final entry, dating it and noting that the protection order is officially in place and active. I write that my support network is solid now, that my boundaries are clear and documented, and that I have real resources backing me up if Henry tries anything. The entry ends with a list that feels important to see written out. Maeve's advocacy support with her direct office line and emergency contact. Officer Kaylee's personal cell number that I can call anytime day or night. Ellis's security contact information from the building. Gray's informed partnership now that he knows everything and has my back. Reese's safe space where I can go without questions, and my own thick folder of documented proof that I took real action to protect myself. I save the document and back it up to 3 different places because losing this record would feel like losing part of my safety. I close the laptop and look around my apartment, taking in all the new locks and security measures that make this space actually feel like mine again, instead of just a place I'm hiding. The knife is back in the kitchen drawer where it belongs, and I haven't checked the window locks compulsively in 2 days, which feels like progress even if it's small. I walk to my bedroom closet and pull out the plague doctor costume that's been hanging there since Halloween, the long black cloak and the beaked mask that hid me so well that night. I fold everything carefully and put it in a storage box, sealing it with tape before pushing the box to the very back of the closet behind my winter coats. I'm not throwing it away because that feels like pretending Halloween never happened, but I'm not keeping it where I can see it every day either. The fear that took over my whole body in that elevator is still there when I think about Henry, but it comes in smaller waves now instead of drowning me completely. That fear isn't making my decisions anymore, isn't keeping me locked in my apartment or jumping at every sound in the hallway. I'm learning to live with being careful, without letting that caution turn into the kind of paralysis that stops me from having a life at all. Okay, real talk in the comments. Have you ever had that moment where you saw someone from your past and just froze? No details necessary, but I want to hear I'm not alone in that feeling. Drop a comment and let's support each other. Hit that subscribe button if stories like this matter to you.